Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. As always, we are very thankful that you take the time from your busy day to watch our program. We hope you enjoyed our series that we did on the anniversary of Waco. Waco happened April 19th, 1993, and for the last two shows, we showed a DVD documentary about Waco. There's many that have been put out there. Last year we showed a different one, but the reason why we're showing this, folks, is number one, we want you to come to the realization and the understanding of just what this insolvent corporation that we call the United States government, number one, is capable of their horrific acts. And number two, it's important that we do not forget our history. Americans have a very short-sighted memory, and some of them events like one that took place, unfortunately, at Waco, we need to keep that in the forefront so we understand with the entity that we're dealing with. The subject we're going to have today, folks, is a subject known as Bretton Woods II. Now, this program is copied and filmed here in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. And right across the river from St. Johnsbury at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, there was a gathering of all the super elite and so forth by the name of Bretton Woods II. Now, Bretton Woods II is a take on the first Bretton Woods that took place in 1944. And basically what it was, folks, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, basically what it was the global elite, the banking financiers, the international banksters, as we like to call them, they got together for the first time, and if you would, at a street level. In other words, they have gotten together with the Bilderberg Group, and in 1954 they began that. Of course, in 1929 they started the Council on Foreign Relations based out of the Pratt House in New York. And what the CFR was developed so that the global elite, particularly the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and others, could have an organization behind the scenes. And then Bretton Woods was a culmination of that in 1944, where they knew the end of the war, being World War II, was upon them, and they were just organizing themselves with regards to what they were going to do with currency, the gold standards, the money systems throughout the conquered world. And when I say the conquered world, folks, well, let's think about this. We fought World War II to supposedly save the world from the Nazis, the Nazism, Adolf Hitler and all that went with it. Of course, as we've demonstrated on this program before, certain American entities out of New York, the Brown Brothers Harriman, Union Bank out of New York, and others out of London, actually financed the Nazi movement, the National Socialist movement in Germany, and we financed Hitler himself. I know that you may find that hard to believe, and maybe at some point, maybe the second anniversary of the show, which is next month, maybe we'll get into this, do a quick recoup on this, because it's very important that you understand what goes on with the wars. They sell you these wars with, we have to go stop Nazism, we have to stop, it could be the war on poverty, it could be the war on terrorism. And folks, what you find is most of the time is that the international banksters are the ones who are financing and fomenting these conflicts. If you remember the slogan of the New World Order from chaos, and it's exactly what's going on today in the Middle East. And as we spoke to you about back in October of 2010 in this broadcast, we got into some depth statements made by Lindsey Williams. Now, if you go on the internet and Google Lindsey Williams, he will come up. But Lindsey Williams was a gentleman who got to work with the elite on the oil side of things. And basically, he sums it up rather well. He says that for 3.5 years, I rubbed shoulders with people that prior to meeting I did not believe existed. And what he's talking about is the world financiers. Now, this is what took place at Bretton Woods. At Bretton Woods, it was the world financiers and or representatives of these entities to coordinate the global effort with regards to, like I said, the gold standard and currencies and so forth. What has taken place at Bretton Woods II recently, and we're going to get into, is the same entity. It's the same entities, formating global policy. Now, we have to ask ourselves, number one, why is this all being done in secret? Where was your media? Folks, the people here in the Northeast Kingdom, the people here in New Hampshire, where was your media covering the fact that all the George Soros and all these international banksters and conglomerates were getting together at Bretton Woods at the, and again, as a take for the Bretton Woods 1 anniversary? How come the media did not let you know of this? Now, let me ask you, folks, if there was a megastars of athletes or movie stars or entertainers that were at the Mount Washington Hotel last week, do you think you would have read about it on the front page? You think there would have been television and radio coverage everywhere? Absolutely. Why is it that you're not hearing about the Council on Foreign Relations? Although now, when we first started doing this research, you know, you were a wacko if in fact you believed that there was a Council on Foreign Relations, and now sometimes you can see some of their speeches on the television set, the mainstream media. And you can also send away for their Foreign Affairs magazine, which I'll tell you, if you really want to read something interesting, read the Foreign Affairs magazine put up by the Council on Foreign Relations, and you'll have a pretty good understanding of what's coming to your life and your neighborhood in the very near future. It's really incredible. And we're going to get into that a little bit with a statement made by one of the presidents of the Federal Reserve banking system. And I went to the Federal Reserve website and got this. They're not trying to hide this anymore. They're pretty much in your face with it. And the reason why, folks, is because if they're going to format themselves as the savior to the crisis that they created, they have to introduce you to be the savior. Before they denied their existence, they acted in secretly, which they still do quite a bit, acting secretly. But the problem being is that now, if they're going to save you, they have to introduce themselves as the savior to you, and that is one reason why more of this information is coming out in the public light. Of course, there's the big spin on it. The big spin is that they're here to save us. The big spin is that they're going to take care of the problem that was caused by this free market and capitalism economic monetary policies that we have. But we have to ask ourselves, who is controlling the economic monetary policies of this country? I know we all think it's the President of the United States, but as we've demonstrated on this show, folks, all we do is elect officials to an insolvent corporation. That's all we do, okay? As we demonstrated to you before, the United States government is insolvent. And it's very interesting. I know we get into this very much so in previous shows, and I would like to read a very quick, actually, you know what, folks? I'm not going to read it because I'll digress myself off to other things. Let's try to stay on the topic today, which is who is controlling the monetary policy of this country. We are an insolvent corporation. We do elect officials to an insolvent corporation, and that's all we do. And you have to think about this, folks. If I'm a business, I'm a corporation, which is what the United States government is. We read verbatim to you the Organic Act of 1871 through the Reconstructionist Acts after the Civil War, when basically the United States government became a corporation. We read to you before from Dun & Bradstreet that list all corporations and what type of corporation they are, that the United States government and all its entities are a for-profit corporation. We've read this verbatim to you. So, who is controlling the policies of this insolvent corporation? And think of this, folks, if you are an insolvent corporation but you're still in existence, you're still operating, am I going to answer to the stockholders /and/or the voters of this corporation? Or am I going to answer to the creditors, the people who are supplementing this insolvent corporation with credit and funds to maintain its operation? It's very simple. I have to answer to the creditors to maintain my operation. And that's what's going on today. That's exactly what's going on today. So, everybody in the United States here thinks that we have money. Again, monetary policies, monetary exchange, money. Well, what is money? And we're going to refer to Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition. And I know some of you who watch this show, I've read this before. Please have patience because there's a lot of people. Folks, our audience is growing in leaps and bounds every week. I'm amazed and overwhelmed by how many people will approach me in the public platform or in the professional platform about, hey, you're the guy on the show. Love your information. You know, we're finally getting answers. I mean, our numbers are growing every day, for that matter. And so I'm not trying to be redundant here, but some of the people are not as educated as others are as to our systems. So we want to read this again. Money, Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition. In the usual and ordinary exception, it means gold, silver, or paper money used as a circulating medium of exchange, and does not embrace notes, bonds, evidences of debt. Folks, note, you think we have a dollar, go to the very top of that entity, that medium of exchange that you're calling a dollar, and you will see a Federal Reserve note. Well, what's a note? We read it verbatim before. A note is an acknowledgement of debt. And as you know from watching this program, the Federal Reserve is a private foreign banking corporation. So basically, our medium of exchange is script from a private foreign banking corporation that we have to pay an interest to this banking corporation because they gave us permission to print it in the first place. Think of that. So for every dollar you have in your pocket, there's an interest bond doing it. So if you print the other money, to pay off the original interest debt on that original dollar bill that's in your pocket, what's going to take place? There is an interest due on the money that you printed to pay the original interest. It's perpetual debt. You can't get out of the debt. And we've got into statements from John Maynard Keynes and some others about how the process of inflation can be used to confiscate the wealth of a government's people. And think of that term of the possession, the government's people. That's in his quote. And if you want to read the book, it's called The Economic Consequence of Peace. But think of that mindset. You consider the government, or supposedly consider the government, to be your possession. It is serving you. Is it really? No. But that's the perception. That's the deception. What's really happening is that the creditors, the international bankers, are driving all of the policies of this country. And folks, if you control the monetary policies of a nation, if you control the issuance of its currency and the value of its currency, what takes place is that you control the rest of it. You control the purse strings, you control everything. It's really very simple, and I think everybody here can figure that out. But again, in its usual and ordinary exception, it means gold, silver, which we no longer have part of our money system, or paper money used as a circulating medium of exchange and does not embrace notes, bonds, and evidence of debt. So what is Black's Law Dictionary telling us? Black's Law Dictionary is telling us that we don't even have money. We have legal tender. By the decree of the king, we have to use this as a medium of exchange. And they make it out of thin air. They make it without anything being backed. There's nothing backing it up. There's no intrinsic value to this entity, to this medium of exchange. But yet they charge us an interest on it because they gave us permission to print it in the first place. And think about the so-called bailout, as the Orwellian term for it, you've come to know it as the bailout. I call it the takeover bill. But think about this. The bankers and all their crony friends throughout domestic and throughout foreign policies, they actually received, as far as we know, we haven't had an update on this figure now in about 4 months, but the last figure we were able to obtain was $28.3 trillion. Now you think of that. $28.3 trillion that we gave the bankers. Now folks, because they gave us permission to give them this $28.3 trillion with a T dollars, we have to pay them an interest to these very same people because they gave us permission to print it to give to them in the first place. Incredible. Just absolutely incredible. So when you look at this, you have to ask yourself, okay, who is controlling the monetary policies of our country? And who is in control? Who are they looking out for? I mean, are they looking out for the people they're supposedly serving, the American people? Or is this a cabal of cronies serving their own self-interest needs? So who's in control is the question here. And this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York website. And I'm going to read this verbatim to you, but not the whole thing, just for time's sake. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is one of 12 Federal Reserve banks of the United States. Okay. Now, do you remember we spoke about the Federal Reserve obviously being a private foreign bank, and we spoke about the United States? If you look up the definition of United States in the law dictionary, you will see it means three things. You will see it means the land that encompasses the United States. You will see that it makes up the Union, the 50 states of the United States, although if you ask President Obama, he will tell you there's 57, and he had one more to visit, the 58th. And if you don't believe me, please go on the internet and Google President Obama has visited 57 states with one more to go. The man doesn't even know how many states are in the Union. Fourth graders, well, I don't know about now, but in my day, fourth graders knew how many states were in the Union, and this supposed President of the United States doesn't even know that there's 50 states in this Union. And the third definition of the United States, folks, was what? The corporation. And we read that verbatim to you. So you got the 50 states that make up the United States, you got the territory that makes up the United States, and the third part of the definition is the corporation. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is one of 12 Federal Reserve banks of the United States. And as you know, it is not federal. It's a private bank. The name was put in by Paul Warburg deceitfully in 1913. So they would have everyone believe that the Federal Reserve was part of the federal government. And also they knew their whole game plan here was to confiscate all the gold and silver from the American people. So he used the word reserve so they could falsely be led to believe that there was going to be a reserve put aside for the good of the American people. Okay, now this is actually, again, I don't want to read the whole thing to you for the sake of time, but this bank is located at 33 Liberty Street in New York. It's responsible for the 2nd District of the Federal Reserve System, which encompasses New York State and 12 northern counties, New Jersey, Baba, Connecticut. We're going to go on with that, okay? Again, I don't want to read the whole thing. But the New York Fed and its president are considered first among equals. It is the largest with most assets and most active by volume and most influential of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And there are 12 Federal Reserve districts in the United States. And if you go on the internet and just punch in 12 districts of the Federal Reserve banking system, you will see, unbelievably so, that they correlate with the districts, not only of the Federal Reserve banking system, but of the United States government. Folks, the federal government was only supposed to be involved in territories, enclaves, and districts, as in the District of Washington, D.C. It was not supposed to be involved in the business of the Union states. Okay? So what the federal government did was they played with the language, and they made all of us districts. So they could, claim they broke down that border of language and terminology, and they encroached it and encompassed the entire country by just merely changing the language. That's all they did. Okay? So if you read the print on this, I mean, I see it all the time. District of Vermont. I see it all the time. And I point it out to people. And people say, well, why is that? Well, again, this is what they've done with language. Okay? It's all about language. Since the founding of the Federal Reserve banking system in 1913, December 23rd, while the Congress was away for the Christmas holiday, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Manhattan's financial district has been the place where monetary policy of the United States is implemented. Although the policy is decided in Washington, D.C., now you're going to think by the United States government, but listen, let's continue the statement. Although the policy is decided in Washington, D.C. by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Folks, this is their own language. This is their own website. Let me read just so this sinks to you who is controlling the monetary policies of this nation. All right, let's read it one more time. There has been a place, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Manhattan's financial district has been the place where the monetary system of the United States is implemented, although the policy is decided in Washington, D.C. by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So why did you go out to vote for Obama or McCain or any other dog and pony show federal entity? Why'd you bother? Again, all we do is elect insolvent people, the insolvent corporation. We elect officials to an insolvent corporation. Who's controlling your monetary system? When it's all said and done, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, a private, for-profit banking corporation. And you wonder why all these bills like NAFTA and CAFTA and GATT and all these bills, that when you read them, this is ludicrous, this is nuts, how they get passed? Because Obama and the rest of them are just taking their marching orders. And they're getting their marching orders from events like the Bilderbergs, like the Trilateralists, like the Council on Foreign Relations, and like Bretton Woods II, that was across the river from us without a thing being said by the local media just last weekend. Think of that. Where was the media for this event? They didn't know about it? That's interesting because some of the media that we pay attention to knew all about it. I can't say how they didn't know about it. Do you remember John Swinton's quote, folks? The one we read verbatim to you. He was the retiring editor of the New York Times. Do you remember that quote? It was really interesting because what he basically said was that all the people in the media were basically, if you remember, they were basically kneeling at the feet of Mammon, and they were intellectual prostitutes, sacrificing their race and their nation at the feet of Mammon. This is why you didn't hear about it in the mainstream media. This is why you're not hearing about the Federal Reserve controlling the monetary policies of this country. This is on their own website. Now, let's see how they describe themselves. The New York Federal Reserve is a private bank and the largest in terms of assets of the 12 regional banks. It's unbelievable. It's responsible for the purchasing and selling of outstanding Treasury securities. All right? And then it gets into, how their profits range about $1.8 trillion a day. And just think about that, folks. For all their profits, on top of the table, what's underneath this table is all the interest that we have to pay to them at that $1.8 trillion a day. Hey, boy, good thing all them banks got bailed out, huh? They needed that $28.3 trillion because their profits are only $1.8 trillion a day admitted. This is what they're admitting to you. Imagine what the real number is. Unbelievable. So don't just turn the channel and say, I don't want to hear about Bretton Woods and Bretton Woods II, because you're going to hear about it, folks, and you're going to hear about it right in your purse strings is where you're going to hear about it. And you're going to hear about it with the blooming domestic security forces. And you're going to hear about it with an increase in tax revenue. And you're going to hear about it with an increase in fuel taxes and costs to you. And you're going to hear about it about through the expansions of wars. This is when all these policies are developed. Not through the halls of Congress and the back rooms of the White House in Washington. They're developed in New York. They're implemented in New York. And they're developed by a private bank. They own admittance to it at a profit of $1.8 trillion a day. This is something to get excited about. And folks, think of this. According to Black's Law Dictionary, we don't even have dollars. They have taken, usurped all of the intrinsic value of what you consider to be a dollar. Do you remember that we read the coinage acts? We read the 4 coinage acts here about 2 years ago with regards to, in the founding era, what was a dollar. And a dollar, because of Article 1, Section 10, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10 of the Constitution mandates that who would control the monetary policy and the issuance of currency in this nation? The United States Congress. That's who has the responsibility and the authority to carry out that task. Who's doing it? A private foreign for-profit banking corporation, you know, is the Federal Reserve, is who's doing it, at a cost to you of interest every day of $1.8 trillion. Who is actually representing the American people at this, when these Board of Governors meet? Nobody. Zero representation for the American people. It's a private corporation, folks. They don't have to let you and I in the door. Think of it. If you owned your own business, and many of you do you have to let your customers inside your boardrooms? Absolutely not. You may have to let the government in because you're a corporation and they control the corporations because of the law that you're in. But who is controlling the policy? They're telling you who is. The Board of Governors of the private for-profit corporation you know as the Federal Reserve banking system. So when you say it's Obama's or Bush's or the Clintons or any of them, folks, since 1933, the United States has been insolvent. This is why they had the National Banking Holiday Act. What a beautiful name, huh? Nice. Banking Holiday Act. We're gonna let all the bank employees take a day off. We're so benevolent. They raped the nation. They confiscated the gold and silver, and by 1965 there was no more intrinsic value in our money. You know, I remember as a child, I remember some of the elderly that I was brought up with. They used to call dimes, nickels, and quarters and pennies. They used to call it silver. You didn't ask for a dime. Do you have any silver? Because they were used to that coin having 40% or 55% silver in content. It had intrinsic value. You knew what it was worth. Today, we just have alloy. There's nothing backing it up. You might as well have monopoly money right out of the box as you do an American dollar, because they represent the same thing. They are play money from a private corporation. The only difference is that you can go out and purchase things with the play money of one and not the other. Folks, there are and we're going to get into this in the next show. Currently, there are 16 states in this country, Vermont being one of them, and I invite you to look up H361. Again, H as in hotel, 361. Go on the internet and punch that in. Read the bill. Go to the end of it. You're going to see that Vermont, along with 16 other states, are actually considering state mediums of exchange or dollars. North and South Dakota and Virginia are farther along in the process than the rest of the states. Vermont is lagging behind, but at least Vermont has recognized what's right around the corner, and that is the collapse of the United States Federal Reserve note, or you know it as the dollar. And folks, that is exactly what was discussed, planned for, and put into play at the last Bretton Woods 2 here in New Hampshire just recently. And we're going to get into this now. It's important that before we could get into this, that you have an understanding of who is controlling your money system, but more importantly, who is not controlling your money system. All these policies, why does the media have the president come up and you know, speak his spew. I'm not being disrespectful, but that's what it is. He's a parrot. You know, if he can't read, remember when the thing fell and he couldn't read no more? Oh, it was all over. It's all he is a parrot. That's all he is. The president is not making decisions, folks. The Congress obviously is not making decisions, but the president's not making decisions. The president is taking his marching orders from the international bankers. And they're marching orders that affect you and your children's future every single day. In October, when we did some of the broadcast information that Lindsey Williams came out, we told you, through his information, that the Middle East was going to be placed into a state of turmoil. Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Libya, goes on and goes on and goes on. That's just since October. We've expanded the war in 4 other nations now. Of course, we did it reluctantly, if you listen to Obama. Now, do you remember who has the ability to send troops to war and to declare war? Right? The Congress. Only the Congress can declare war. Then the president becomes the commander-in-chief and implements the policies of war. Did you hear of any declaration by the Congress to go to war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, any of them? No, you didn't. The last time we went to war, just recently in Libya, the president didn't even make a phone call to one congressperson. Not one. Who's he taking his marching orders from? You better think of this, folks, because if the president can get away with this, it's all lost. Maybe George Bush was right. And what I'm speaking of, when George Bush made the public comment that the Constitution is just a GD piece of paper. Does it have any enforcement anymore? Who controls the monetary policy? Baron Rothschild, give me control of a nation's currency. I care not. Who makes its laws? Pretty interesting when you understand where we are. So these agreements at Bretton Woods, too, the whole thing that they were talking about basically was the collapsing of the dollar as no longer being the reserve currency. All right? Very interesting. But I think what we have to do is go back to Bretton Woods 1 to get an understanding of exactly what took place there. Now, you have to understand that basically Bretton Woods 1 took place, again, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the George Washington Hotel, which, by the way, folks, is an absolutely gorgeous facility and building. I mean, it was built for the elite. The people who originally built this had it as a competition for Newport, Rhode Island, because, you know, the Warburgs, the Vanderbilts, and the Mellons, and the Carnegies, and the Rockefellers, and the J.P. Morgans, and the Schlicks, and all these people, they used to vacation in Newport. And if you go down to Newport, a lot of their mansions are still there, and you can tour them and see how these people were living in the early 1900s, never mind today. Okay? So the Bretton Woods facility itself was built as a competitive thing to get the rich and elite to come to northern New England. And they did a fine job of it. And it was pretty successful. But it was very secluded. And so what they wound up doing was they had a group of international bankers get together so they could have the street sense of it controlled. And what they did basically was they sort of came to the agreement that, okay, yes, there's a big pie here, and we're competing amongst ourselves for the pieces of this pie, and we're getting bits and bits and bits here. Well, why don't we work together and take the whole pie? That's basically what happened at Bretton Woods in 1944. But you have to listen how they sold it. How did they sell? They didn't have to sell Bretton Woods 2 because your media never covered it. In 1944, there was still a little bit of media, not much, but there was still a little bit of true media in this country. Not much of it. And this is from the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's one of our recommended reads, written by a gentleman, G. Edward Griffith. Very, very dedicated, long-term, fantastic researcher. And here's what he has to say. In 1944, the meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at which the world's most prominent socialists established the Monetary Fund and the World Bank as mechanisms for eliminating gold from world finance. Wow. Think of that. They met to coordinate an effort to control all the gold and silver and to get it out of your hands. And they met to not only get it out of your hands, but they met so the fact that the governments could have fiat money, fiat medium of exchange or currency that was based on nothing. They could print it out of thin air. Well, think, folks, what does that do? Number one, they confiscate all the true wealth of the nations. And number two, it allows these governments at all different levels to go ahead and go into debt because they can create all this money without having to be locked into a gold standard. In other words, back then, an ounce of gold was locked in at $35. So the federal government, if it had X amount of gold on hand in its stores, could only have a budget of X amount of gold times $35. That was it. It couldn't go into debt. It was locked to the gold and silver standard. But what took place here was that when they relieved this deadline or this command of money, basically it allowed these governments to go into debt. But who'd they go into debt to? They went into debt to the very same people, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, the very same people that confiscated the intrinsic wealth of the nation. And how they do this, and we got into this from the 1908 Aldrich Bill. We got into the panics of 1898 and 1908 and 1904, how they created these panics, and then the Aldrich Bill got shot down, and then in 1913, while the Congress was away on December 23rd, 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Act through a very few select of Congress that were part of the ploy. It's amazing. But when they met in Bretton Woods, what was they to do? Establish the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as mechanisms for eliminating gold from the world finance. The hidden agenda behind the IMF and World Bank revealed as building a world of socialism, the role of the Federal Reserve in bringing that about. So that's what they were looking to do. Okay? Basically, folks, I can't read this whole thing to you for the sake of time, but I do want to read some of this to you. The game began an international meeting of financiers, politicians, held in July of 1944 at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was officially called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, but is generally known today simply as the Bretton Woods Conference. The two international agencies that were created in that meeting are the International Monetary Fund and its sister organization, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Now, folks, you know that as the World Bank. Oh, and do you remember the Grace Committee? You must remember the Grace Committee. We had a lot of comments about it. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, when he became president, decided he wants to find out where all the money's going that the federal government is taking in from its tariffs and taxes and levies and so forth. And he appointed a committee that became to be known as the Grace Committee because the chairman, last name was Grace. So, and you go on the internet, look this up. So what happened was, when they got into what you know as income taxes, they came to the understanding that not one penny of your income taxes goes to the operations of the government. We did an entire show on that. We read it verbatim to you. You can go back at www.katv.org and you can watch the show. We did an entire show on this one subject matter where not one penny of your income tax goes to the operations of the federal government. But what did we discover where all that money did go to? We discovered it went to the International Monetary Fund. So, the announced purpose of this organization was admirable. In other words, this was to sell to the people. Okay? Here's how they sold it. Now think of the time here, folks. This is 1944. Of course, the world had already been divided up post-war. In 1942, they had the Tehran Conference, and the Tehran Conference already decided how they were going to divide the world up after World War II, which they fomented and funded on all sides. Okay? So the world was divided. They knew how they were going to divide it, but now they needed to know how they were going to control the currencies. And here comes the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, how'd they sell it to the American sheep? The World Bank was to make loans to war-torn and underdeveloped nations so that they could build stronger economies. Again, we're so benevolent. You know, we're only doing this for the good of you. We're looking out for your interest. So we're going to deceitfully have you volunteer to pay an income tax, and you're going to take a portion of your earnings every year, and you're going to give it to us. So we can do this benevolent organization and funding throughout the world. Again, it's 1944. The world is in chaos. The world, you know, Europe is destroyed. A lot of Asia is destroyed. A lot of the Med is destroyed. Not all, but a lot of it. The International Monetary Fund was to promote monetary cooperation between the nations by maintaining fixed exchange rates between their currencies. So benevolent. It was to terminate the use of gold as the basis of international currency exchange and replace it with a politically manipulated paper standard. In other words, it was to allow the governments to escape the discipline of gold so they could create money out of nothing without paying the penalty of having their currencies drop in value on world markets. Again, I just got done reiterating and speaking about this, the discipline of gold, the standard. If let's just say the United States government had 1 million ounces of gold and silver on hand after they confiscated all your ancestry's wealth, and then it was at $35 for gold and an ounce. Well, they could only do 1 million times 35 million, because they were locked into, as G. Edward Griffin put it, the discipline of gold. There was a standard they could not encroach upon. What's our national debt now? And don't tell me the 14 trillion, excuse me. Our obligatory debt, folks, is $52 trillion. Look it up for yourself. $52 trillion. And what do I mean by our obligatory debt? They've robbed every fund you've been paying into. Social Security, Medicare, the rest of it. They've been robbing it. Since 1964, it's been being put in the general budget and used. There's no fund sitting aside for Thomas L. D'Ambra, because I've been paying into it since I was 15 years old. That money's going out as a pay-as-you-go system to the people who are receiving the benefit at that time for all this time, and then the rest of it puts into the general budget and is being used. Folks, when we bombed Bosnia, the United States Congress, unbelievably so, would not fund the military operation. You know where the funds came from? Bill Clinton took it from the Social Security Administration. Look it up. And he took his orders from a gentleman who was outside of any kind of elected capacity. His name is, I forget his name right now, Yves Salona. Look it up. It's incredible. But back to the Bretton Woods, what this did was it allowed the federal governments to go into debt. It not only confiscated all the intrinsic wealth of the people, it allowed the governments to go into debt. They didn't have to sell war bonds no more like they did in World War I and World War II. There weren't World War bonds being sold for the 16 years of Vietnam, for the 3 years of Korea, or since 1991 in Iraq. Why? They don't need it anymore. They're not locked into that discipline. They're locked into a system of fiat, legal tender, and debt. It's important that you understand, folks, exactly where we are. For every single so-called dollar in your pocket, there is an interest due on it. And that's your children and their children, and it just goes on. It's perpetual, folks. The system was set up to keep us into debt. Okay. Now, you have to understand that this policies that are taking place are all orchestrated behind the scenes. In other words, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was created and developed, as you know from watching this show, a place called Jekyll Island, which is an island off of Georgia. And they went to where J.P. Morgan's estate, and they all met secretly. And then they developed this legislation and then passed it secretly, while the Congress, as we said, was away for the Christmas holiday. This Bretton Woods agreement, folks, is the same thing. Yes, George Soros and all his cronies, and we're going to get into George Soros right now, and all his cronies, yes, they've already got the language done. They've already know what they want to implement. They already know their goals, and they already know the means to go about this. Now they've got to sell it to you. Now all that's left is for them to sell it to you. And of course, they have to fill out their marching orders to Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. will fulfill the demands. Because after all, that's who they're answering to. We just read that to you verbatim. The Federal Reserve creates the monetary policies of this country. It's on their own website. They're bragging about it to you. Okay, now a lot of what goes on in Bretton Woods and what took place, you have to ask yourself, were they successful? Was the International Monetary Fund developed and promoted? Absolutely. Doing rather well, seeing they take all of your income taxes every year. They're doing very well. Imagine the confiscation of wealth, folks. They don't even have to produce a product for you to give them your earnings. The product that they produce is deception and authority. They have you deceived that there's a law that says you have to pay an income tax, and they have the authority to back up the non-law. That's their product, deception and authority. Folks, if you can find the law that says there is a law that you have to pay an income tax, I invite you to find it, and I invite you to go to wethepeople.org and many other organizations that are offering a very large monetary reward if you can find the law. Very large. But here's a hint for you. I can name 6 former IRS agents right now, as one said it rather well, I'm going to put this baby to bed and collect the money. None of them have been able to find the law. Joe Bannister, Joseph Current, others. Shirley Jackson, I mean, there's others. There's so many of them. They can't find the law, but we do it every year. Folks, you actually volunteer for it. You fill out an application to do it. Of course, we do it because of deception. We've been schooled this way, taught this way. And of course, you don't want to pay your fair share. Don't forget, folks, the income tax originally was only supposed to be 2% and only to the wealthy. Now the average American, believe it or not, folks, is paying 56% in taxes from what dollar comes out of their pocket. That's where it is right now. 56% of your earnings goes to the government directly through taxes and levies and tariffs. And folks, think of this. That does not include the cost of producing a product in this country because of all the mandates from OSHA and the EPA and all the rest of them. Any alphabet soup agency you want to mention. You know, I know a lot of people in business. And I know there's a lot of people in business that are watching this show. And you ask yourselves, who's the highest profit gainer in your business? Is it you? The one who's doing all the work, all the brain work, staying up at night thinking about how I'm going to do this, how I'm going to stay away from that, how I'm going to broaden this, how I'm going to increase my profit margin, about the raw materials I need to place this product, about my employees, about all the headaches with finance and everything else I got to do. Are you reaping the most from your efforts? I don't believe you are. And as a matter of fact, statistically, I can tell you you're not. I can tell you that the federal, state, and local governments, government as one single entity, is making more profit and taking more of your time and putting mandates on you and obligations on you that you're really not controlling much of your business. They'll tell you who to hire, who not to hire. They'll tell you what taxes and revenues you have to pay out to them. And their policies also affect you. Their policies of being outside your direct business affect you. Cost of fuel, cost of insurances. It's incredible. So who's making all this profit? Folks, the biggest employer in the country right now, do you have any idea who it is? It's the government and all its entities. The government is the fastest growing entity in the labor market right now, and particularly with the prison and security forces. Folks, we are on our way, actually it's here, to a domestic security force that has never been known in this country since the days of English troops being on this land. And they're answering to the very same banking interest that the security forces of the King of England did previously. Same thing. When you go back and look at the control of governments throughout centuries, folks, you've got to start with the Bank of England through the Rothschilds. You've got to start with the Warburgs, or is known here as Warburgs, out of Germany. And they went on. The Rothschilds went on to control all of Europe, the Americas. You want to do some interesting research, folks. You never hear about the War of 1812. Go and research the War of 1812, because there you can actually see that the War of 1812 was the control of the money system here in this country. You never hear about the War of 1812. You never hear that the British burned the West Wing of the White House and left. Folks, you got to ask yourself, maybe another show, another time, what documents were they after? And the White House was actually invaded and burned? Yes, it was. The West Wing of the White House. Very, very interesting. But we're running out of time here, folks, and I digress because it's just a web of all entanglement. But we're going to continue with the Bretton Woods, and we're going to continue this because it's so important, folks, that you understand that, number one, your media is leaving you blind. There's a lot of local media here in the Northeast Kingdom and northern New Hampshire and Vermont. But these were international financiers, all meeting at the George Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and not a peep of it locally or anywhere on the news. Not a peep. If there was athletes and movie stars there, it would have been the cameras everywhere. Not a peep. And all they're doing, folks, is making policy that are going to affect your life today, tomorrow, and long down the road to your grandchildren. And not a word of it. So next week, we're going to get into just number one, who orchestrated this Bretton Woods II? Who put it together? Why? I mean, folks, they spent over $250 million orchestrating this, according to their own records. $250 million. You think there's some kind of gain out of here that they're looking? And when we review the names next week, some of the names you're going to recognize. And we're going to tell you who they're the front men for. The first name I want to come up to you is George Soros. What do you really know about George Soros besides you know his name? What do you really know of the man? You know, the woman who's on the Republican side of things, she's part of the Spinmeister, but she made a comment that I read, and I found it interesting. And she said that the Democrat left have a Nazi collaborator as their ringmaster. The ringmaster she was speaking of was George Soros. And the average person would probably say, now what is she talking about? The person on the left would say, oh, she's a nut anyway. And the people on the right are going to say, wow, what's that about? Folks, put the two together. And we're going to get into that next week. We're going to get into who is George Soros. Who is he working for, George Soros? Who is he a front man for? Who is he taking his marching orders from? Why was he so instrumental in spending $250 million out of his funded organization to put this together? What are the goals? Why to have this anniversary held, Bretton Woods 2, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, because of the first one was so successful? Folks, what they are getting into, and we'll get into more detail, is that they are planning and implementing the collapse of a medium of exchange, that what you have come to know as the dollar. And we're going to get into that next week. As always, folks, we are very thankful you take time from your busy day to watch this program. We know a lot of this information is startling to you, but folks, look what is in front of you. Look what's here. Look at the system we're locked into. Look at how far we've gone outside of the boundaries of the United States Constitution. You know, I think about this all the time. If we followed the Constitution, we wouldn't have had one armed conflict since World War II, because the last time we declared war was December 8th, 1941. We wouldn't have $52 trillion in debt because we were locked into a gold standard of intrinsic value of gold and silver. We wouldn't be bonding our children through an entity known as the birth certificate. We wouldn't be paying an income tax. We wouldn't have the federal government involved in anything to do with the states, to include law enforcement, commerce, education, housing, all of it. Folks, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here to get back to where we belong. What we have to do is identify the who, the what, and the wheres of what's going on. We all know something's wrong. Something's drastically wrong, and it's about to get a lot worse. This isn't me making a prediction. This is me reading their own readings, their own language, their own plans, their own journals. Folks, we need to wake up. We need to understand we and the representatives that we supposedly elect are not in charge. Who is in charge? We'll read it one last time right here. Actually, who is in charge? All right? The Federal Reserve of New York in Manhattan's financial district as a place where monetary policy in the United States is implemented, although the policy is decided in Washington, D.C. by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The New York Federal Reserve is a private bank. That's who's in charge. You can go elect any dog and pony representative you want. All that is a show. That's all it is. It's a show. We are not in charge. That power has been usurped from the American people and its system of representation. And now we find ourselves $52 trillion in obligatory debt. We find ourselves bonding our children. We find ourselves in a blooming domestic security force. We find ourselves with a medium of exchange of a note, which is provided by a private for-profit banking corporation. All of this was preventable if we had just stuck to the document that was so much sacrifice was made to implement, and that is known as the United States Constitution. With that being said, folks, again, we are very thankful for your time that you watch our program, and as always, we remind you that your government is your responsibility. Thank you for watching.